On a Tuesday in October of 1991, Annette Bell stepped off a plane at Houston Hobby carrying a black dress, an old canvas bag, and a leather-bound diary that could detonate her entire family. She had not set foot in the city in 7 years. Not since the night she walked out of her father's house on Windsor Street, holding a secret so heavy she had carried it across state lines, across a whole life built on pretending she did not know what she knew. Earl Bell, her father, was dead, killed by a falling Buick in his own auto shop on Lyons Avenue. The call had come from her baby brother Joey at 3 a.m, voice cracked, words tumbling out between sobs. By sunrise, Annette had booked a flight she had spent 7 years swearing she would never take. But Earl was gone now. The man who could punish her was gone. And there were things that needed to come home with her. Things wrapped in a dish towel at the bottom of a canvas bag. Things written in her father's own hand. Dates, initials, dollar amounts, and one name that had been written and rewritten in Earl's tight, furious script. A name she had read once a year, every October, for 7 years. She didn't know it yet. But at that very moment, somewhere between Atlanta and Houston, a woman was riding south with a 7-year-old daughter and a reason never to have come back. A woman who, by the end of this week, would walk into Earl Bell's funeral reception with a little girl in tow and stand in Earl Bell's house, smiling, like she had every right to be there. Her name was Patrice, and the diary in Annette's bag held exactly why. Oakland, California. October 1991, the night before the flight. Annette Bell sat cross-legged on the floor of her studio apartment, the leather-bound diary open in her lap, a single lamp throwing a yellow circle around her like a witness stand. Outside, the city hummed its low, indifferent hum. Inside, the apartment smelled of cold coffee and the kind of loneliness that settles into a room when a woman has been living alone with a secret for 7 years. She had taken the diary in 1984. She had read it. She had understood exactly what it meant. And she had done nothing. Not because she didn't believe it. She had believed it the moment she read Earl's tight, furious handwriting. June 14, 1984, P. confirmed. Will handle. Believed it when she read June 30th. Spoke with Mignon money delivered. Bus ticket Atlanta. She goes. Believed it when she read November 4th. Word from cousin. P. had the baby. Girl, healthy. Keep away from me. She had done nothing because Earl Bell was her father. And in 1984, Annette Bell was 21 years old, and 21-year-old daughters in Eastside Houston did not accuse their deacon fathers of using young black girls like motel towels and paying their mothers to make them disappear. They packed their books, they went to college, they got on planes, they told themselves they would figure it out later. Later had come and gone and come again. 7 years of later. 7 years of opening the diary once a year in October, the month Earl had first taken her to Pleasant Hill, and reading it through and closing it and putting it back in the bottom drawer of her dresser and going to bed. She had been afraid. She could admit that now, in the lamplight, with the flight booked and the black dress laid out on the chair and her brother's voice still ringing in her ear like a cracked bell. But the fear had a second floor, and that was worse, because Annette had not only been afraid of Earl, she had been afraid of what would happen to Joey if she told. Joey, who was 18 then and 25 now, and who had worshipped the man the way boys worship fathers who never once look at them cross-eyed. If she exposed Earl, she would burn the only father Joey had ever known, and so she had waited. But Earl was dead now. The man who could punish her was dead. And a funeral, Annette had learned in 28 years of covering other people's grief for a living, was not a place to keep secrets. It was a place to bury them. She closed the diary. She wrapped it in a dish towel. She put it in the canvas bag. And the next morning, she got on a plane. Houston, Texas. 1984. The summer the heat didn't break. Earl Bell ran Bell's Auto on Lyons Avenue out of a cinder block shop with a tin roof and a hand-painted sign. Black folks on the east side brought him their Chevys and their Cadillacs, and Earl fixed them with hands that knew metal the way a preacher knows the Bible. He was 52 years old, a deacon at Pleasant Hill Missionary Baptist. A man who stood at the front of the church every Sunday in a white suit, calling on the Lord to save the sinners. But Earl had a weakness, and her name was Patrice. She was 19, the daughter of a woman who cleaned houses in the Heights. Patrice worked the register at the diner on the corner of Lyons and Manor, 2 blocks from Earl's shop. Earl had been eating his noon plate there for 11 years. He had watched her grow up. He had watched her blossom into a quiet, soft-spoken young woman with dark skin, full lips, and a smile that could light up a dim room. One afternoon, when the diner was empty, Earl lingered. He ordered a slice of sweet potato pie. He watched Patrice wipe down the counter, and when she bent to pick up a fallen napkin, something in Earl Bell, something he had kept locked in a back room of his soul for 30 years, broke open. He slid off the stool. He walked around the counter, and he cornered her by the register. Patrice tried to laugh it off. "Mr. Earl, you're a deacon. What you doing back here?" Earl didn't laugh. Earl didn't move. His eyes went dark. And in that moment, with the parking lot empty and the cook in the back and the radio playing Al Green on the counter speaker, Earl Bell did the thing he had spent his whole life pretending he would never do. He took what he wanted. The next 2 months were a fever. Earl would find excuses to come by the diner. He'd park his Cadillac out back, behind the dumpster, and Patrice would slip out of her shift and into the passenger seat. They drove to a motel off the Beltway. They drove to a cabin his cousin kept in Liberty. Patrice told herself it was love. She had to. Because the alternative, that a man old enough to be her father was using her like a rag in a back room, was something she could not afford to think about. And then her period didn't come. The morning she told him, she was standing in the diner parking lot. She waited until his usual time. She watched him pull in, kill the engine, and step out of the Cadillac. She walked up to him before he could reach the door. She didn't say a word. She just held up the little white stick with the pink plus sign. Earl stared at it. His face didn't move. His hands didn't shake. But something behind his eyes, some load-bearing wall of his entire life, began to crack. "How far along?" he asked. 6 weeks, Patrice whispered. "Maybe 7. Earl was quiet for a long time. He looked at the diner. He looked at the street. He looked at the sky as if he was trying to find God in it. Then he looked back at Patrice. "You go inside," he said. "You go back to work. And you don't say a word to nobody. You hear me?" "Not a word." Patrice nodded. She didn't trust her voice. That night, Annette, home from her sophomore year at Texas Southern, sharp-tongued, observant, always watching, noticed that Patrice was different at the counter. Quieter, paler, and that Earl, who never stayed past his pie, had left a 20 under his coffee cup. A $100 tip in 1984 money on a $2 tab. Annette filed it away. She didn't say a thing, but she filed it. 3 months later, Earl made his move. He drove to Patrice's mama's house on a Tuesday night when Patrice was working the late shift. He sat in the kitchen. He poured himself a cup of coffee. He didn't look Mom in the eye. "Your girl is in trouble," he said, "and I'm the one who put her there." Mama went still. The color drained from her face like water from a sink. "Mr. Earl, I'm a deacon. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I am a man of God. And I need this gone." He reached into the pocket of his coveralls. He set a brown paper bag on the kitchen table. The bag was thick. The bag was heavy. Mama didn't open it. She didn't have to. They both knew what was inside. "She leaves Houston," Earl said. "She leaves tonight. She takes the bus. She goes somewhere. Dallas, Atlanta, I don't care. She has the baby. She gives it up or she keeps it. I don't care about that neither. But she disappears, and nobody, not a soul in this family, not a soul in this neighborhood, not a soul in that church, ever hears her name again." Mama's hands were shaking. The coffee cup rattled in the saucer. "And if she doesn't?" Mama whispered. Earl looked up, and for the first time in his life, Mama saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Not anger, not even cruelty. Something worse. Finality. "She will," he said, "or I will make her." Patrice got the news in the back booth of the diner at 11:47 p.m. Her mama was waiting for her in the parking lot. Mascara streaked, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight the knuckles had gone bone white. "Baby, get in the car." "What happened?" "Mama, what?" "Get in the car, Patrice." At home, Mama had already packed. A single suitcase sat by the front door. Patrice's coat was folded on top. Her good shoes, her Bible, and a brown paper bag half open, the green at the corners of $100 bills just visible at the seams. Patrice stared at the bag. Then she looked at her mama. "Mama? No." "Baby? No." Patrice's voice cracked. I am not going to disappear for that man. I am not going to be his ghost. I am not going to." "What do you want me to do?" Mama's voice broke open like a window under a rock. "What do you want me to do, Patrice? He is Earl Bell. He knows every judge, every cop, every deacon in the East Side. He will bury us. He will bury your daddy. He will bury me. And he will do it smiling in a white suit with a Bible in his hand. What do you want me to do?" Patrice sat down on the floor. She put her face in her hands. And for a very long time, the only sound in that little kitchen was a 19-year-old girl sobbing so hard her whole body shook, and a mother crying silently beside her, both of them understanding, finally, completely, that some sins are not fought. They are only survived. The Greyhound to Atlanta left Houston at 2:15 a.m. Patrice sat in the back of the bus, suitcase between her knees, the bag clutched against her chest, the bus vibrating beneath her like a long, low moan. She was 4 months pregnant. She was alone, and every mile marker they passed, Lufkin, Nacogdoches, the Louisiana state line, felt like a knife being driven a little deeper into the part of her that used to believe in men. She called Earl a coward in her head the whole way to Atlanta. She called him worse things in her prayers. But what she never once allowed herself to do, not in the motel rooms, not in the clinic waiting rooms, not in the months of morning sickness and midnight crying, was hate the baby. She never hated the baby. Aaliyah Mosley was born on January 8, 1985, in a county hospital in Atlanta. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, a head full of dark hair, and a pair of eyes that Patrice looked into for the very first time and felt her whole heart crack wide open. Aaliyah had Earl Bell's eyes. Patrice saw it instantly. So did the nurse, who looked at the baby, looked at Patrice, and very carefully did not say a word. Patrice raised her daughter alone. Waitressing shifts, night school, 2 apartments in 7 years. A cousin who helped when she could, and a mother back in Houston who sent what little she could spare and prayed every Sunday that God would forgive her for the bargain she had made. Patrice never went back to Houston. She told herself it was to protect Aaliyah. She told herself it was to build a new life. But the truth she carried in the quiet of her kitchen at 3 a.m. when the baby was finally asleep, was that she was afraid. She was afraid of Earl Bell. And the day he died, on a Tuesday in October of 1991, when the news crawled across a TV screen in a diner in Atlanta, Patrice dropped a plate of eggs on the floor and did not move for a long, long time. Earl Bell was dead. The man who had built a cathedral of his own reputation on her silence was dead. And for the first time in 7 years, Patrice took a full breath. Houston, October 1991, 7 years gone. Annette Bell was 28 years old. She had a degree in journalism from Texas Southern, a job at a small newspaper in Oakland, and a hard-learned rule: do not go home. The last time she had been to the house on Windsor Street, she had stood in her father's bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of his nightstand, and pulled out a leather-bound diary. The diary was full of dates and initials and dollar amounts and one name, written and rewritten in Earl's tight, furious hand, that she would never forget. Patrice. Annette had taken the diary. She had not told a soul, and she had walked out of the house that night, got in her car, and driven to California before the sun came up. She did not speak to her father again. She did not speak to her mother. She spoke to Joey maybe twice a year, on the phone, short calls, the kind where both of you pretend the air is not full of everything you are not saying. But on a Tuesday in October, Joey called, and his voice sounded like a man whose legs had been cut out from under him. "Daddy died, Nettie. He was under a Buick in the shop. The jack slipped. The car came down. He was gone before the ambulance got there." Annette closed her eyes. She had waited 7 years to feel something about Earl Bell: relief, anger, grief, anything. What she felt was nothing. A flat, gray emptiness, like the sky outside her Oakland apartment window that morning. But Joey was crying, and Ruby, her mother, who had aged 20 years and 7, was in the background, wailing, and there was no one else. So Annette booked the flight. The funeral at Pleasant Hill was a spectacle. Earl had been a pillar of that church for 30 years. The pews were packed, the choir sang, the deacons in their white suits stood in a long row at the front, hands folded, faces solemn, every one of them knowing, and not one of them saying, what kind of man they were burying. Annette sat in the third row on the left. She wore a black dress she had bought at a thrift store the day before. She kept her hands folded in her lap, and every few minutes her fingers would drift to the canvas bag at her feet, where the diary sat wrapped in a dish towel, waiting. The eulogies went on. Cousin after cousin. Deacon after deacon. Annette tuned them out. She watched the back of her mother's head, the stiff set of her neck, the way Ruby's hands twisted a white handkerchief into a knot. Then Joey stood up. He was 25 now. He worked as an HVAC technician, made good money, had his own truck. He was the son Earl had wanted. Quiet, obedient, willing to take over the shop one day. He walked up to the pulpit in a black suit, hands shaking, and unfolded a piece of paper. "I want to tell you all about my daddy," Joey said. His voice broke. He started over. "I want to tell you all about the man who taught me how to rebuild an engine, and how to treat a woman, and how to walk with God." Annette's jaw tightened. He went on. He talked about lessons learned. He talked about Sunday dinners. He talked about the time Earl had walked him to his first day of school and squeezed his shoulder and said, "A bellman takes care of his own." Then Joey paused. He looked down at the paper. He smiled. A real smile, the first one Annette had seen from him in years. "And Daddy, I want you to know, even though you're not here to see it, I am going to take care of my own. Because 2 weeks ago, I asked the woman I love to marry me, and she said yes." The church erupted. "Amen! Bless him, Lord." Hugs from the deacons. Tears from Ruby. Joey stood at the pulpit, beaming, the picture of a grieving son with a future still intact. Annette didn't move. She didn't smile. She just reached down, slowly, and put her hand on the canvas bag. The reception was held at the house on Windsor Street. The whole block came through. Sweet potato pie, fried catfish, sweet tea in mason jars. A slideshow of Earl's life playing on the television in the living room. Earl young, Earl middle-aged, Earl standing in front of Bell's auto with his arms folded, Earl in his white Sunday suit. Annette stood in a corner of the dining room, paper plate in her hand, watching. That was when she saw her. Across the room, near the cake table, stood a woman in a navy blue dress, late 20s, dark skin, a face that hadn't quite lost the softness of youth. She was holding a little girl's hand. The girl looked about 6 or 7, hair in 2 braids, a white bow in each one. The woman was laughing at something Joey's cousin had said. She leaned down. She whispered something to the little girl. The little girl giggled. Annette's plate hit the floor. The plate didn't break. The piece of cornbread slid off. The fork clattered. Nobody seemed to notice. But Annette's heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Her hands had gone ice cold. The room had gone tilted, the way rooms do when the floor drops out from under your life. Patrice. It had been 7 years. The face was older, the body fuller, the hairstyle different. But the eyes, those quiet, watchful eyes, were exactly the same. Annette's mind raced. Patrice, here, in this house, in Earl Bell's house, holding a little girl's hand. Why? She didn't have to wonder long. Joey walked up. He put his arm around Patrice's waist. He bent down. He kissed the little girl on the forehead. "Everybody," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, "this is my fiancée, Patrice, and this little angel is Patrice's daughter, Aaliyah." A polite smattering of applause, aunties cooing, cousins smiling. And in the corner of the dining room, Annette felt the blood drain from her face like water from a cracked glass. The diary was in the bag at her feet, and Patrice, that Patrice, was standing 10 feet from her, smiling into Joey's chest, with a little girl whose bright eyes looked just like Earl Bell's. Annette didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of the guest bed in her old bedroom. The room still had her high school trophies on the shelf, the wallpaper her mother had never bothered to change, and she read the diary by lamplight, page by page, the way she had read it 100 times before. But this time, she read it looking for one thing: proof. June 14th, 1984. P. confirmed. Will handle. June 30th, spoke with M. Money delivered. Bus ticket Atlanta. She goes. July 22nd, confirmed arrival Atlanta. P. sent to cousins. Do not contact. November 4th, word from cousin. P. had the baby. Girl, healthy. Keep away from me. Annette closed the diary. She pressed her hands flat against the cover. Her breath was coming in short, sharp bursts. Earl had not just impregnated a 19-year-old girl. Earl had not just paid her to disappear. Earl had continued for years to receive updates about her, where she lived, where she worked, whether the baby was a boy or a girl. And the girl. The little girl with the white bows in her braids, the little girl Joey had kissed on the forehead in front of the whole reception. Aaliyah was not Patrice's daughter by some boyfriend in Atlanta. Aaliyah was Earl Bell's daughter, Annette's half-sister, Joey's half-sister, which meant that Joey, the man Earl had raised as a respectable son, the man who stood in church yesterday and promised to take care of his own, was about to marry the mother of Earl's own child. Annette put her face in her hands, and in the dark of her old bedroom, she made a decision. She would tell Joey. She had to. She owed him that much, even if he hated her for the rest of his life. But first, she had to talk to Patrice. She had to hear it from Patrice's mouth. The next morning, Annette found Patrice alone in the kitchen. The reception was over. The relatives had gone home. Ruby was upstairs, sleeping. Joey had taken the truck to the shop to talk to the mechanics about closing Earl's accounts. Annette closed the kitchen door behind her. Patrice was at the sink, washing the good crystal. She didn't turn around. "I knew you'd come in here," Patrice said quietly. "I've been waiting." "You knew?" "I knew the moment I saw you at the reception. I knew you'd put it together." She set a glass down. Her hands were steady, but her shoulders were trembling. "You were always sharp, Annette. Earl said that about you. He said you were the only one in the family who ever scared him." Annette's mouth went dry. "How long have you been back in Houston, Patrice?" 8 months. 8 months? Joey and I met at the shop. He came in to fix a unit. We started talking. We started seeing each other. He didn't know who I was. I didn't know who he was, not for the first 2 months. I swear on my mama's grave, Annette. I didn't know. Annette gripped the edge of the counter. Her knuckles had gone white. "And when you found out," Patrice turned around. Her eyes were red. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I almost left. I packed a bag 3 times. I called my cousin in Atlanta 3 times to come get me. But by then I loved him, Annette. And I prayed that maybe God was giving me a second chance, a way to come home, a way to belong to a family that had taken everything from me the first time." Annette's vision blurred. The room was tilting again. "You knew you were marrying a Bell." "I knew. And you knew Aaliyah was—" "Don't say it." Patrice's voice cracked. "Don't you say it! I know who her father is. I have known for 7 years. I have looked at that little girl's face every morning and seen him in it, and I have carried that. I have carried that alone. And when Joey asked me to marry him, I thought, maybe if I could just be part of this family, maybe Aaliyah could finally have a father who would stay." The kitchen was silent. The clock on the wall ticked. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Annette pressed her palms into the counter. She could feel her own heartbeat in her fingertips. "Did you ever think," Annette said slowly, "about telling Joey? About telling any of us?" "I have spent 7 years terrified that Earl would find me," Patrice whispered. "I changed my name. I moved twice. I raised my daughter on waitressing shifts in night school. And then Earl Bell died. And I thought maybe I was finally free." She looked at Annette. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set. "I am not the villain in this story, Annette. I am not the one who—" Her voice broke. She stopped. She started again. I was 19. "And your father?" "I know," Annette said. Her voice was hoarse. I know. Then what do you want from me? Annette looked at the door. She looked at the diary in her hand. I want you to come to the will reading, she said. Tomorrow, at the lawyer's office. I want you to be there. I want you to be in the room. And I want you to tell the truth. Patrice's face went white. Annette, no, I can't. Your mother, your brother. My mother has been protecting that man for 30 years. My brother is about to marry the mother of his own father's child. Patrice, you have been a ghost in this family for 7 years. Tomorrow, you become a person. The house on Windsor Street was quiet by 11 p.m. Joey had gone back to Patrice's apartment to gather the last of his things. Cousin Gerald had gone home. The Deacons had gone home. The leftover cake sat on the counter, half-eaten, the icing beginning to dry and crack at the edges like an old smile. Ruby was in the kitchen. Annette found her there, sitting at the table in the dark, still in her black dress, her church hat in her lap, her hands folded in front of her like a woman waiting to be sentenced. Mama, Annette said. Ruby didn't look up. I knew you'd come in here. I knew you'd come in here before you went to bed tonight. Then you know why I'm here. Ruby lifted her eyes. They were dry. They had been dry for hours, which was, in its own way, the most terrifying thing Annette had ever seen. Her mother had cried at the funeral. Her mother had cried at the reception. Her mother had cried into a white handkerchief for 3 days. And now, in the dark kitchen, Ruby Bell was out of tears. I knew about Patrice. The words landed in the room like a dropped glass. Annette didn't move. Her hands, which had been reaching for the chair across from her mother, stopped midair. How long? From the beginning. Ruby's voice was flat, practiced, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this sentence in her head 1,000 times. He came home that night and he told me. He sat at this table and he told me exactly what he had done, and he told me what he was going to do about it. And I did nothing. Ruby cut her off. The words came out sharp, almost defiant. I did nothing, Annette. I sat at this table and I watched my husband drink his coffee and I said, yes, sir. I said, yes, sir, because I was 46 years old and I had not worked a day outside this house since I was 19, and the shop was in his name, and the house was in his name, and the cars were in his name, and the church was in his name, and I had 3 children to feed. And Earl Bell was not a man you said no to. He was a man you survived. Annette's breath caught. The room was tilting again. So you let him send a 19-year-old girl out of the city with a bag full of cash and a baby in her belly? You let him do that? I let him do that. Ruby nodded. I let him do that, and I went to church on Sunday, and I stood at the front of that church with my arms around his waist, and I smiled. And I have smiled in this kitchen every single morning for 7 years, Annette. Every single morning. I have eaten my breakfast across from a man who got a child on a girl young enough to be his daughter. And I have smiled. And if you think I don't know what that makes me... Her voice cracked. For the first time that night, something human moved across her face. If you think I don't wake up at 3 a.m. and see that girl's face in the dark... Mama, I could not save her, Annette. Ruby was whispering now. I could not save her. I could not save my own self. Earl Bell was a deacon. He was a husband. He was the man who paid the light bill and put the roof over our heads. And he was a monster. And I knew he was a monster. And I did nothing. And that is a sin, baby. That is a sin I will carry into that box when they put me in the ground. Annette sat down, slowly. The chair scraped against the linoleum. Then help me do something about it now. Ruby looked at her. The will reading is tomorrow, Annette said. I'm going to open that diary in front of Joey. I am going to read it out loud, every line, and Patrice is going to be there, and Aaliyah is going to be there. And if you want to keep one single thing in this family that is not a lie, Mama, you are going to stand up in that room and tell the truth. You are going to tell Joey that his father was not the man he thought he was, and that you knew. Ruby's face crumpled, not into tears, into something older than tears, something Annette had never seen on her mother's face before. Shame. If I do that, Ruby whispered, I lose my son. If you don't, Annette said, you lose him anyway. You just lose him slower. The clock on the wall ticked. The refrigerator hummed. The dark outside the window pressed against the glass like a held breath. And Ruby Bell, who had survived Earl Bell for 30 years by never ever saying a single word she had not been given permission to say, looked down at her folded hands. "I'll be there," she said. The next afternoon at 3 o'clock, the Bell family gathered in the conference room of Mosley, and Reed on Dowling Street. Annette, Ruby, Joey, Patrice, who had come in spite of her terror, Aaliyah at her side, and cousin Gerald, who Earl had named executor. The lawyer, a thin, soft-spoken man named Mr. Lott, opened the file. He read the standard provisions. Bell's auto went to Joey. The house on Windsor Street went to Ruby. The savings, in about $40,000, was to be split 3 ways between Ruby, Joey, and Annette. Standard. Clean. The will of a man who had spent his whole life appearing to be exactly what he was not. Then, Mr. Lott paused. "There is one more provision," he said. He looked up. Earl added a handwritten codicil dated 4 days before his death. It reads as follows. He cleared his throat. "To my granddaughter, Aaliyah Patrice Mosley of Atlanta, Georgia, I leave the sum of $25,000 to be held in trust by my wife, Ruby Bell, until the child reaches the age of 21. The room went very, very quiet. Ruby made a small, strangled sound. Joey looked at Patrice. "Granddaughter? Patrice, what is he?" And then he stopped, because Patrice was standing, and her face was white as chalk, and her hands were gripping the back of the chair in front of her so hard the wood creaked. And Aaliyah, who was 7 years old, was looking up at her mother with big, frightened eyes. "Joey," Annette said. Her voice was calm. Too calm. "Sit down." "Nettie, what is—" "I said sit down." Joey sat. Ruby made a sound like a wounded animal. Cousin Gerald looked at the ceiling. Annette pulled the diary out of her bag. She set it on the table. She looked at Joey. "Daddy left $25,000 to Aaliyah. He left it in trust to Mama. He did not leave it to her as Patrice's daughter. He left it to her as his granddaughter." The words landed in the room like a hammer dropped from a height. Joey's mouth opened. No sound came out. "The woman you are about to marry, Joey," Annette said, "is the woman our father impregnated when she was 19. The little girl she is raising is our father's daughter, which means—" "Stop!" Joey's voice was barely a whisper. "Stop, stop, stop!" But Annette did not stop. "If you marry Patrice, you are not marrying a stranger. You are marrying the mother of your father's child. And the little girl you're planning to raise as your own daughter is your own half-sister." The room erupted. Ruby screamed. Cousin Gerald stood up so fast his chair fell over. The lawyer dropped his pen. And Joey sat perfectly still, his face the color of old ash, his eyes fixed on Patrice, his mouth working, but no words coming out. Patrice stood very straight. She had not cried. She had not moved. She had known. She had known this moment was coming for 7 years, and she had decided in the dark, in the kitchen, alone, that when it came, she would not be the one who broke. She bent down. She took Aaliyah by the hand. She looked at Joey. "I loved you," she said. Her voice shook, but it did not break. "I loved you, and I should have told you. I have carried this secret for 7 years, and I am sorry. I'm sorry I did not speak sooner, but I will not apologize for the lie that brought me into this room. Your father did what he did to me when I was a child myself. Your mother knew. This family," her voice cracked, "this family built itself on my silence, and I am done being silent." She looked at Ruby. She looked at Cousin Gerald. She looked at the lawyer. "My daughter is not a secret. My daughter is not a scandal. My daughter is here." She squeezed Aaliyah's hand, and if this family wants to pretend she doesn't exist, they will have to pretend in front of her. She turned. She walked out of the conference room. Aaliyah walked with her, 2 braids swinging, head held high. The door closed behind them. And in that conference room, with the afternoon lights slanting through the blinds, the Bell family sat in the rubble of a lie that had lasted 30 years. 3 days after the will reading, Joey Bell walked into the house on Windsor Street at 9:30 in the evening. He had not been there since he was 18. He had moved out the night he took over the shop. The house still smelled the same: pine sol, bacon grease, the faint, sweet rot of the magnolia tree that pressed against the kitchen window. He had told himself he was coming back to get his tools. He had told himself he was coming back to check on the place. He had told himself a lot of things in 3 days. None of them were true. Ruby was in the kitchen. She was sitting at the same table, in the same chair, in the same dark. The chair Earl had sat in was empty beside her. The second coffee cup, Earl's cup, the white one with the chipped handle that Ruby had kept in the cabinet for 30 years like a relic, was still set out at his place, as if he might walk in at any moment and pour. "Mama," Joey said. Ruby didn't look up. "I heard the truck." "Yeah. You want some coffee?" "No, Mama. I don't want coffee." Ruby nodded. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. Joey sat down across from her. The chair creaked. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed its low, indifferent hum. "I need to ask you something," Joey said, "and I need you to tell me the truth. Not the church truth, not the daddy's a good man truth, the real truth, the one you've been carrying around this house since before I was born." Ruby's hands tightened in her lap. "Joey, did you know?" 2 words. The 2 words that had been sitting in Joey's chest for 3 days, growing heavier, sharper, eating through his ribs like acid. "Did you know what Daddy did to Patrice? Did you know he got that girl pregnant? Did you know he paid her mama to put her on a bus? Did you know he had my half-sister walking around Atlanta for 7 years with his eyes on her face? Did you know, Mama?" Ruby closed her eyes. "Did you know?" The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on Windsor Street, its headlights sweeping the kitchen window like a searchlight. "I knew," Ruby said. The words came out flat, hollow. The voice of a woman who had been holding her breath for 30 years and had finally let it out. "You knew." "I knew from the night he did it. He came home, and he sat in that chair and he told me every detail. He told me what he had done. He told me what he was going to do. He told me Patrice's name and her mama's name, and the color of the bag the money was in. And I sat in that chair and I said, 'Yes, sir.' And I have been sitting in that chair saying, 'Yes, sir,' ever since." Joey's face didn't move. His hands, flat on the table, had gone white at the knuckles. "All those years," he said, "all those years I sat in that church pew. All those years I watched Daddy stand up at the front in his white suit. All those years I told my friends my daddy was a deacon, Mama, a man of God, and you sat in that pew right next to me. And you knew. I knew. And you said nothing. I said nothing." Joey stood up. The chair scraped against the linoleum. The sound was louder than it should have been. A sharp, ugly sound that filled the kitchen like a scream. "Then I have a question for you, Mama." His voice was shaking now. "And I need you to answer it. Not for Daddy, not for the church, not for the family. For me." Ruby opened her eyes. They were wet now, finally, for the first time in 3 days. "If I had been the girl," Joey said. "If I had been 19. If I had been working at a diner 2 blocks from this house, and a man old enough to be my father had used me the way Daddy used Patrice, and then put a bag full of money in my mama's hand and told me to disappear." His voice cracked. He pressed his hands flat on the table. He leaned forward. "Would you have smiled at him the next Sunday, Mama? Would you have stood at that altar with him? Would you have let your son call him Daddy?" Ruby didn't answer. "Would you, Mama?" "No," Ruby whispered. "No, I would not have." "Then how could you?" The words hung in the kitchen like smoke. Ruby pressed her hand over her mouth. Her shoulders began to shake. And for the first time in 3 days, in the dark kitchen on Windsor Street, in the chair next to the empty place where Earl Bell used to sit, Ruby Bell began to cry. Not the polite, handkerchief-soaked crying of the funeral, not the practiced public grief of a deacon's wife. This was the other kind, the kind that comes up from the basement of a person, the kind that has been locked in a room for 30 years and fed through a keyhole and is now, finally, allowed out. Joey stood at the table. He watched his mother cry. He did not go to her. He did not touch her. He did not say, "It's okay, Mama," or "I forgive you, Mama," or "Daddy's in a better place, Mama." He just stood there, and he let her cry. And after a long time, he reached into the pocket of his jacket. He set a small, folded piece of paper on the table. It was Aaliyah's birthday card, the most recent one, the one with the steady loops, the careful spelling, the child's careful, "Dear Mr. Bell, my mama said to wish you a happy birthday. I hope you are well. Love, Aaliyah." "I'm going to go see her," Joey said. Ruby looked up. "Patrice, I'm going to go see her. I'm going to ask her to let me see Aaliyah. Not as her fiancé, not as the man who almost married her, as the man who should have known, as the uncle I should have been 7 years ago." He straightened up. He looked at the empty chair across from his mother. He looked at the white cup with the chipped handle. "Throw that cup away, Mama." He walked out of the kitchen. He walked out of the house. The screen door banged behind him, a sharp, ugly sound, like the closing of a book you can never open again. And Ruby Bell sat alone at the table, in the dark, in the chair next to the empty place. And she did not pick up the cup. She did not throw it away. She just sat there. And she cried. There is a kind of lie that a family can carry for so long that it becomes the foundation. Earl Bell built his entire life on the silence of a 19-year-old girl. He built his church standing, his business, his reputation as a deacon, his marriage, his fatherhood, all of it, every brick on top of one girl who disappeared onto a Greyhound bus with a suitcase full of cash and a baby in her belly. And for 30 years, it held. But here's what Earl Bell did not understand, and what a great many powerful men never understand. You can build a house on a secret, but the house is not yours. It belongs to the secret, and the secret will come back. It always comes back. It comes back in a face you recognize across a crowded room. It comes back in a child with your eyes. It comes back in a diary, in a will reading, in a lawyer's office, on a Tuesday afternoon, when the light slants through the blinds and the truth, finally, brutally, beautifully, walks in the door and sits down. Patrice lost a fiancé. She lost 7 years of a life she had tried to build. She lost the family she had prayed might accept her, but she won custody of her own story. And that, in the end, is the only inheritance that matters. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have a story of your own, a secret your family carried, a truth that came out too late, a silence that broke open, drop it in the comments. We read every one. We hold everyone. And you are not alone in it. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you never miss a story. We'll see you in the next one.